we spoke about schemas and appraisals. Recall that schemas are the knowledge and beliefs that we hold about different situations, objects, people, and even ourselves. These schemas influence how we appraise interactions with those things. Aaron Beck's cognitive model of depression puts the role of negative schemas and appraisals at the forefront. Beck proposed that negative schemas and appraisals can contribute to the development of depression and also its continuation, also known as maintenance. Beck's model argues that people with depression hold a negative self-schema. People with a negative self-schema will have negative beliefs about themselves. Beliefs like, if I don't have a good job, then I'm worthless. Similar to some of the genetics models we've discussed, Beck argues that these negative self-schemas just hang around in the background until they become activated. The negative self-schema will become activated after a person experiences significant life stresses. So for example, imagine a person who has believed all their life that their self-worth depends on the prestige of their job. They might suddenly develop depression if they suddenly had to quit their high-paying job to become their spouse's carer. Because that job was so crucial to their feelings of self-worth, the loss of that job can trigger the activation of that negative self-schema. This in turn then triggers those thoughts and feelings that we recognize in people with depression, such as inappropriate guilt, feelings of worthlessness, and losing hope. When we discussed emotions, we noted that people with depression are more likely to turn their attention towards sad faces, a phenomenon known as attentional bias. What's really interesting is that low mood also affects our memory in a similar way. Just as people with depression are more likely to attend to sad faces more readily and also to interpret neutral faces as negative, low mood makes people more likely to remember negative events and to interpret neutral events as being negative. This phenomenon is known as memory bias. One of the characteristic thought patterns of depression is rumination. Rumination is a repetitive and cyclic pattern of negative thinking, where the same or very similar thoughts just get recycled over and over and over again. But what's interesting about rumination is that it's not only a symptom of low mood, it can actually cause low mood too. But of course, it's not just negative schemas, appraisals, and thought patterns that contribute to depression. Remember the good old biopsychosocial model? Sure, there are psychological factors that can contribute to depression, but what about the biological and the social factors? If you think back to our genetics video, you'll recall that we spoke about the serotonin transporter gene 5-HTT. Remember that some people have 2 copies of the short serotonin transporter allele, and some people have 2 long alleles, and some people have 1 of each. People with 2 copies of the short allele are more likely to develop depression after a stressful life event like trauma in childhood or losing a loved one. Serotonin helps regulate both our emotions and also other neurotransmitters in the brain, including dopamine, which is linked to reward. So, when the levels of serotonin become disrupted, it can play havoc with our emotions. We also know that social factors like isolation tend to exacerbate depressive symptoms, but on the flip side, people with depression often experience symptoms that make it really difficult to maintain friendships and sustain social support. One of these symptoms is a difficulty in trusting people, and there actually seems to be an underlying cognitive and possibly biological process underpinning this tendency. Let me explain. Joint attention is a phenomenon common in social animals. It's our tendency to direct our own gaze to the location of someone else's gaze. If you just looked over here, then you've experienced that tendency firsthand. Anyway, Bayliss and colleagues presented participants with pictures of different objects, and they asked them to classify whether the object was found in the garage or in the kitchen. They presented the object on either the left or the right-hand side of the computer screen. Now, just before the object flashed on the screen, the participants were presented with a face that either looked towards the direction of the object or the face looked away from that location. The researchers found that people were faster at categorizing an object when it was preceded by a face gazing towards the object direction versus when the face was gazing in the opposite direction. What's really interesting is that the participants also rated these helpful faces as being more trustworthy, even though none of the participants had any idea that the direction of the face's gaze actually predicted the location of the object they needed to categorize. But here's the kicker. When participants with a history of depression performed the same task, although they still showed the same joint attention effect and directed their attention towards the location that the face was looking, they didn't then transfer this into feelings of trustworthiness like the other participants did. They were still getting a perceptual benefit, but they weren't getting the social benefits that everyone else was getting. And so we can see once again that it doesn't really make sense to look only at social aspects of depression, or only at biological effects, or only at psychological effects. These factors really need to be considered together as they all influence each other. Thanks for watching. In the next video, we'll see how the biopsychosocial model can help direct and inform treatments for depression.